The Gibson fretboard binding that extends over the fret ends is the nightmare feature of every guitar repair guy and the dream feature of every guitar player. By the end of this video, you may understand why most guitar repair guys will tell you to get lost if you bring in your Gibson guitar to their shop for a refret job and explain to them you want to keep the binding over the fret ends on your guitar, as this process is extremely tedious and time consuming, and I will show you exactly why I did it anyway on this Gibson Les Paul custom guitar. Based on the serial numbers, I can tell this guitar was made in 1979 around April, and one fun fact, the guitar has a volute on the back of the headstock which reinforces the neck, a feature that Gibson made from 1970 till 1981 in the Norlin era when the guitar company changed owners. A shame they didn't keep this feature, as they decided to remove it altogether and rather went with a flat profile in the neck. Now back to this repair. This model has the 3-humbucker configuration, which is not very common, and if you were to sell this guitar today to the right buyer, you could probably get close to $10,000, which is why you need to keep everything as original as possible when you are repairing a guitar like this, as simply replacing the binding and relacquering the neck would lower the value of the guitar itself. So the main reason this guitar came in our workshop is to replace the frets as they were worn down and to restore the binding without removing the original binding itself. I am heating up the frets, so when I pull them out I get as little tear out as possible. Of course, you have to be extremely careful here, as you don't want to melt the binding if you apply too much heat. I am dealing with ebony wood here, which is very brittle, so when you pull the frets out on an ebony fretboard which were previously glued in, it's impossible to get no tear out. But that's not a problem. I can simply fill the gaps with some CA glue and some ebony dust, and when I sand the fretboard flat, you won't see any tear out. Some of the binding on the neck that extends over the fret ends is still intact and in good shape, so I have to be extremely careful when I'm sanding that I don't sand them off. I have this special sanding block that extends over the binding so that I can sand the whole fretboard flat on both edges. The process of water popping is used in many woodworking areas, and it's a great trick to achieve a smooth feeling on your wood.
What the heck?
Anyway, you let the water dry off and then you fine sand everything back up to 1500 grit. After the fretboard is fine sanded and leveled, it's time to cut up the frets. Important thing to know is you need to have a slightly bigger radius on your frets according to your fretboard, but not too much, because otherwise when you push the frets in the fretboard, they can sometimes push the binding out and you can crack the lacquer and the binding itself. So you need to check every fret by itself if your neck has a compound radius. After I make the correct overbend on my frets, I rough cut every fret so that it fits between the binding on the fretboard. And when I rough cut all of the frets, it's time to fine sand every fret by itself on both ends to make sure it fits perfectly between the binding on the fretboard, so when it is installed there are no gaps between the end of the fret and the binding. Otherwise I need to replace the fret. Now you can do this by hand if you want to spend a whole month just fitting in the frets, or you can use a belt sander, as this process is already tedious and time consuming as it is, and this will save you quite a bit of time. The first fret is fitted snug, and now I just need to repeat this process 21 times more, and then I'll be done with the first phase of the fret fitting. Now you want to make sure to spend extra time and care on this process itself, because this is what will set apart amateur and professional guitar repair guys. When everything is said and done, you can pick up any Gibson guitar that was refretted and take a closer look where the fret end meets the binding. If there are small gaps between the two, you know that the work was done by an amateur. And if there are no gaps and the frets are snugly fitted throughout the whole neck, you will know this was done by a professional. The next process is something you can do or don't, but you may regret it later on when you install the frets. So let me explain by doing a quick drawing so you can picture it better of what I'm talking about. The first thing I do is take a Sharpie and color both ends of the fret. If you cut up the neck in half and you look at it from the side, this is the perspective that we're looking at. This is your fret and it is made up of the top part and the bottom tang that fits in the fretboard. This is the binding around the fret, and what I'll be doing here is sanding the bottom of the fret, the tang that fits in the fretboard, at a slight angle, so when I push the fret in the fretboard, there is no way that the sharp end of the fret blows out the binding on both ends of the fretboard. This is all just an extra step to make sure that you don't cause any damage when you push the fret in the fretboard itself. And also to make sure that when you apply the glue, it has somewhere to sit when you push the fret in. I should mention that I only sand a slight angle in the bottom tang of the fret here. I do not touch the upper part that sits on top of the fretboard. That is why I use the Sharpie in the beginning to mark where I'm taking off the material. And once again I repeat this process for all of the 22 frets, and then I'll be done with the fret fitting process. I hope this explanation of what I'm doing here made sense. It's quite some nerdy stuff. You can see there's really just a slight angle on all of the fret ends. It's a really subtle change, but it makes a world of a difference later on when I'll be installing the frets. Before I install the frets, I have to make sure all of the fret slots are wide enough for the new frets, and I also remove any glue residue that was left over. I also use a small file to take off the edges of the fret slots because I'm working with ebony here, which is very brittle, and I don't want to have any chip out or tear out when I'm pressing the frets in. Now before I start pressing the frets in the neck, I want to find the correct radius so that when I press the frets in, I will get a nice snug fit. I already measured beforehand. This is the 12-inch radius. I'm trying this new tool out. Take the handle, take your screw, tighten it up, and there you go. After many hours of prep work, it's finally time to install the frets. I'm using wood glue in the fret slots to fill any gaps and to make sure that the fret will fit nice and snug when I press it in. Also, years down the road, this guitar might need to be refretted again, so using wood glue means that it will be much easier to pull them out as to using CA glue, for example. As using CA glue on an ebony fretboard almost certainly means you will have tear out when pulling them out. So I'm doing a huge favor to either future me or any other repair guy or girl who will be doing this. As you can see, all of the frets are fitted perfectly and there are no gaps, so I'm really happy with how this turned out. The only slight setback is that two of the pearl inlays jumped out of the fretboard as the glue that held them in gave in a long time ago. After all, this is a 50-year-old guitar, so this is nothing uncommon. This should be a simple fix, right? Well, not really. I had a total brain fart when I was trying to quickly fix this and I cracked one of the pearl inlays. I should have known better. It was late in the day and I was trying to wrap things up. I've dealt with pearl inlays many times and I've installed many of them, and I should have remembered that if you use any kind of force to force them in, they would crack easily as they are very brittle. So instead of doing things slowly and the right way, I now get the reward of fixing the mistakes after myself and spending an extra hour or two fixing something that should have taken me at max a couple of minutes. So that's great. The first thing I was trying to do was fill the cracks with very thin CA glue and sand everything down to see if the cracks would disappear. Sadly, that didn't work, so there was no choice but to remove the pearl inlay completely and replace it with a new one. Luckily, I had the original Gibson Pearl inlays in stock, so I just had to clean everything out, fit the new inlay to the correct size and press it back in, but very gently this time. I remove the bulk of the material with a router bit, and then I take a sharp chisel to remove any glue residue and clean the corners and to make sure all of the edges are square and straight. Then I take the new inlay and shape it to the correct size. Apply some glue and place it in. Seal off the edges with some thin CA glue and let it dry for 24 hours before I sand everything down so it is smooth and level with the fretboard. So while I'm waiting for the glue to dry, I can tackle the reason that you probably clicked on this video, and that is how to fix the damaged binding that extends over the fret ends on a Gibson guitar. As mentioned in the beginning, this is a very rare original 1979 Gibson guitar, and these models are worth several $1,000s, if not even over $10,000 if they are in good condition and if everything is original. So the only way to repair this is to keep everything as original as possible. I could remove the binding completely, replace it with a new one and relacquer the neck, but that would mean the guitar would not be in its original state and the value of the guitar would be drastically decreased. So the only proper way to repair a guitar like this is to leave everything as original as possible and work around it. And this is the solution I came up with. So the first thing I had to do was remove all the grease and dirt from the existing binding, so I took some Q-tips dipped in alcohol and wiped everything down. Then I mixed up this 2-compound epoxy and made sure I dyed it to the correct color of the existing binding. So when everything dries, the transition from the binding to the epoxy will be completely seamless. Now I just apply a generous amount of epoxy on all of the fret ends across the fretboard, and I make sure all of the cracks and gaps are filled up so that when I sand everything down I won't have to do this process again. I also used the heat gun to heat up the epoxy and remove any micro bubbles, and made sure it was thick enough before I applied it to the binding so that it doesn't spill across the fretboard or the neck. And in the background you can hear the sound of Balkan, as in my neighbor beating the living piss out of his carpet. So now that all of the gaps on the binding are filled up, I flip the guitar upside down just to make sure the epoxy won't drip all over the neck when I leave it to dry overnight. After 24 hours the epoxy has dried and hardened, so before I start the long and tedious process of shaping each fret end by hand, I first need to shape and sand down the inlay that I repaired a day earlier. Every time I post a refretting video, I get a few comments asking why I color the frets, and the answer is pretty simple. When I'm leveling and sanding all of the frets, I need to know where I'm taking off the material, so this is the most simple way to do so. Now this part of the repair is the reason why most luthiers and repair guys will tell you it's not worth it to repair the binding on your Gibson guitar, and they would rather just sand the bindings off and fret till the edge of the fretboard. Unless you have a vintage Gibson original guitar like this one, or you have way too much money on your hands and just want to spend it. This guitar has 22 frets, which means it has 44 fret ends that I need to dress and sand down by hand. Shaping each fret end by hand takes a couple of minutes, so you can do the math on how many hours this process takes, plus all of the prep time to get us to this point. So adding up all of the man hours times the hourly rate, the total outcome sometimes exceeds the price of the guitar itself. Which is why this is only done on expensive Gibson guitars and collectible items that need to be playable as well. The restoration of the binding is done, and at the end I will have some aftershots of this repair so you can tell me if I nailed the color of the binding or not. But for now I need to finish the refretting process. First I recrowned all of the frets, then I use the Scotch pad to smooth everything out, and then I start the fret polishing process. I start the fret polishing process with 1500 grit sandpaper, and I move up the grits till I reach 8000. A quick tip when you're polishing up the frets with extra fine sandpaper, you always want to go the same direction as you bend the strings, as this will give you the smoothest and glass-like finish on your frets. Then I use extra fine steel wool wire, which is very fun to say, before I polish each fret by itself. Then I use some alcohol just to clean up the fretboard and remove any polishing compound that was left on the fretboard before I apply some lemon oil, let it sit for a bit, and then I wipe off the excess oil from the fretboard and the frets. And there you go. Now that the refretting process is done and the binding has been restored, I just need to make a new bone nut, set everything up, and then I can call it a day. I'll be making the new nut out of this raw piece of bone. Online you can find many pre-made bone blanks, but they are basically just bone dust mixed with glue and made in a mold so they can fit any string spacing you'd like. You just need to shape them a bit and place them on your guitar, which is fine, but the bone blanks that are made out of dust and glue are actually way softer than the real 100% bone nut. Plus, the sustain on a nut made out of real bone will be much better, and the material is harder, so it will last much longer. I also noticed that the neck pickup ring is broken, so I'll quickly fix that before I put everything back together. I just applied some small amount of CA glue, held everything together for a couple of seconds so it dries, and then I put everything back together. Now it's just about putting all of the moving parts back on the guitar. The customer wanted the 1046 Elixir strings, and I'll be using the Ibanez nut files to show you how you can achieve the perfect string spacing on your nut on any stringed instrument you make. The first thing I do is set an even spacing from the edge of the fretboard to the high and low E string. I'm using this math formula to calculate the perfect string spacing on my nut. The A component means the inner distance between the high and low E string. The B component is the sum of the thickness of all the inner strings, which is written on the back of the string package. And the C component is the number of spaces between the inner strings. In my case, I'm using 6 strings, so that is 5 spaces between the strings. And after I solve this complex Einstein equation, I get 6.56 millimeters, which is the distance between all of the inner strings. Now you can see why these Ibanez nut files are crucial for this process. These are the only nut files that are small enough so they can fit under the calipers. I lock in the calipers with the correct string spacing calculation, and then I simply press the nut file against the calipers, which I use as a guide, and that's how I get an even string spacing across all of the 6 strings. You can use this string spacing method on any stringed instrument you make, either a 12-string guitar or a 4-string bass. The process is always the same. Just make sure you make the calculations twice before you start filing the nut. Now the last step is setting everything up. I make sure I set up the correct string height as we discussed with the customer. I set the pickup height, and I fine-tune the intonation point on the bridge before putting the Les Paul custom truss rod cover back on. This concludes the fretboard restoration on this 1979 Gibson Les Paul custom guitar. Here are some aftershots of this repair, so let me know what you think. If you made it this far in the video, you have hopefully seen how much work goes into a repair like this. I also hope you picked up a few tips and tricks along the way. And if you would like to see more of this type of videos, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel or become a member here on YouTube or on Patreon. All of the links are in the description below. I will have 2 short sound demos playing at the end, so thank you for watching and I will see you in the next one.